Okay, let's continue. Our next speaker is Vesna Liponik. Vesna is a research assistant at the SAZU, Institute of Philosophy, and a PhD candidate at the institute itself.
Yeah, at the postgraduate.
At the postgraduate school. Vesna's research interests range across multiple junctions, connections between politics, ontology, and aesthetics, as well as literary theory and stylistics. Vesna is particularly interested in the transformations of the concepts of animal and human in contemporary philosophy and aesthetics, and I guess this is reflected by the title of the paper you are presenting today. The title of Vesna's presentation is The Uncanny Animal. Thank you, Vesna.
Thank you. So my point of departure is slightly different, and my question here is more like whether a particular psychoanalytic tool could help me think what I want to think, whether I could somehow appropriate it to my own means. So yeah, I think this presentation will be quite different from all from the ones that were before me. So the framework for my discussion, or rather for some more like preliminary thoughts on the subject, is Freud's short essay, A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis from 1917, from which I will make some excursions into the question of the grotesque, always on the trail of what can be called the uncanny animal. So one of the best known critiques of the psychoanalytic animal as Oedipal is probably Deleuze and Guattari's in Mille Plateaux. Oedipal animals invite us to regress, draw us into a narcissistic contemplation, and they are the only kind of animal psychoanalysis understands. The better to discover a daddy, a mommy, a little brother behind them. End of quote. But these are not the only animals that psychoanalysis or Freud understands. So in the short essay, A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis, first published in Hungarian, Freud deals with what he calls effective reasons for rejecting psychoanalysis. It begins with a brief introduction to the libido theory of neurosis and proceeds to the 3 blows to human narcissism, or rather 2 kinds of difficulty which amount to the same thing. So the first blow to human narcissism is cosmological and refers to the work of Copernicus, and the second one is biological and refers to the work of Darwin. Freud introduces this blow by discussing what he elsewhere calls human megalomania. Quoting, "In the course of the development of civilization, man acquired a dominating position over his fellow creatures in the animal kingdom. Not content with this supremacy, however, he began to place a gulf between his nature and theirs. He denied the possession of reason to them, and to himself he attributed an immortal soul, and made claims to a divine descent which permitted him to break the bond of community between him and the animal kingdom." End of quote. So man first had to assert his superiority and then justify it. The question arises as to why this second step, why superiority as such is not enough, why the difference has to be made. It is not very difficult to answer this question. What is decisive, however, is the way in which this difference is made by Freud. He uses the formulation of denial and attribution. So what he says is that man refuses to admit something, to attribute something to animals. To deny something means to refuse to give something that could also not be denied, so that there could actually be something that, if there were a human will to it, could also be attributed to the animal, and in the same way as it was denied. So it is not so much a question of what humans have or possess and animals do not, and how this can be proven, but rather a sovereign and arbitrary decision conditioned by the preservation of previously asserted superiority. So this is in stark contrast to the prevailing positioning of the dividing line between humans and animals that we can observe in all too many occasions in the history of Western philosophy. Here I would like to draw attention to Derrida's understanding of Heidegger's use of the word walten, defined as a rule or to prevail, although, as Derrida notes, lacks clear definition, as if it is at once the event, the origin, the power, the force, the source, the movement, the process, the meaning, etc., whatever you like, of the ontological difference, the becoming ontological difference of the ontological difference. So words associated with Walten are significant also. Gewalt suggests violence, but also force, waltet und verwaltete, to do with management or government. Derrida traces these words through Heidegger's text to theorize the apparent but unclear connection between Walten and sovereignty, noting that all beings exert violence, exert themselves within a field that promises potentiality, potency, force. It is as if to be beings and Walten were the same thing, where Walten of beings differs from the Walten of the human is in their respective and specific relationship to this violence. So humans claim this violence as their own. They not only embody or are gripped by it, but are besieged by it. So this is claimed by Heidegger to be the key to Dasein's alienation in the world, its Unheimlichkeit. Yet, as Derrida emphasizes, because man is seized, gripped, durch Walten, by the Gewalt of this Walten, and it is because one forgets this and attributes to this man as to a subject, the initiative or the invention of language, comprehension, etc., this is why man has paradoxically become a stranger to his own essence, because he believes that he is the author, the master and possessor, and the inventor of these powers. He ignores the fact that he is first of all gripped, seized, that he must take them on, and he then becomes basically a foreigner. This is the whole story to his Unheimlichkeit. The third blow that Freud mentions is psychological and the most wounding, since both of the other two blows lead to this one, to the fact that the ego is not master in its own house. So by pointing these three blows in succession, one could say that Freud seems to suggest that if man is not even master in his own house, how can he claim to be master in any house? So at this point, we could ask with Montaigne, is there anywhere else a creature so ridiculous and at the same time so wretched, so miserable, who cannot even control himself, but wants to rule and govern the whole universe? What resonates in this statement is Derrida's bêtise, a form of sovereignty, but not a sovereignty as a right or capacity to rule, but as a form of violence, a form of stupidity, absurd and excessive. For how else might we describe a claimed superiority by humans over animals, whether based on intelligence, reason, communication, if not as a kind of stupidity, which in its very exercise confirms a right to stupidity inherent within sovereignty itself. In order to specify this relationship, it might even be more useful to use or slightly revise the concept of grotesque sovereignty, introduced by Foucault in his lecture on 8 January 1975. Foucault is calling grotesque the fact that by virtue of their status, a discourse or an individual can have effects of power that their intrinsic qualities should disqualify them from having. He uses the term grotesque or ubuesque in reference to Jarry's Ubu Roi, the classical work of modernist grotesque. And grotesque sovereignty is, according to Foucault, one of the cogs that are an inherent part of the mechanisms of power. It is one of the essential processes of arbitrary sovereignty, something that has characterized Western politics from the beginning. He traces its origins back to the Roman Empire, drawing a line from Nero, who was perhaps the founding figure of the outrageous workings of the despicable sovereign, to Mussolini. Our suggestion here is, of course, a slight extension or adaptation of the term to the specific situation we are describing. Although, a good literary example of grotesque sovereign in more strict Foucauldian sense is a grotesque sovereign with an uncanny disorder, in Freud's terms, is Ahab from Melville's Moby Dick. Ahab could also be read in the connection with another uncanny phenomenon, the double. In Sexualno in Ontologia, Alenka Zupancic touches on the figure of the human animal and the question what exactly is the work in the philosophical and psychoanalytical definition of the difference between humans and animals. In the last part of the book, She deals with the phenomenon of the double as a meaningful result that bundles most of the book's questions. So the question of difference that is different from other differences, the question of one, its repetition, duplication, and the question of the reality of the same. Our question here is whether the difference between humans and animals can also be read in the light of this phenomenon. We will try to answer this with the help of Melville's Moby Dick. So the narrator of the story is Ismail, a crew member on board of Pequot, captained by Ahab. Pequot is not a regular whaling exhibition, but on a hunt to fulfill Ahab's prophecy. So there are two prophecies in Moby Dick, or you could also say three prophecies. The first one is by Ahab's mother, and is of course referring to his name, and leads to Ahab losing his leg while whaling Moby Dick. We learn of the second prophecy before the crew sets off on their exhibition. So Ismail and his companion, the harpooner Quequeg, go to see Pequot in port and realize that they are being followed by Eliah, who also bears the same name as the prophet who cursed the biblical king Ahab. And Eliah hints that the ship and its captain, and consequently the entire crew, are doomed. And also, when Ismail and Quequeg meet Eliah again the another morning, even Ismail is not entirely sure that he has not seen the ship as already a ghost ship. So this could be the second prophecy, yet it could also be the same as Ahab's prophecy, or could refer to Ahab's prophecy, quoting what Ahab says about the prophecy. The prophecy was that I should be dismembered, and I lost this leg. I now prophesy that I will dismember my dismemberer. Now then, be the prophet and the fulfiller one. That's more than you great gods ever were. End of quote. So Ahab is both his own prophet and the fulfiller of the prophecy. And even when, at another moment in the book, when he asks himself who sets him on this path, he answers, surprising even himself, Ahab. But what role does Moby Dick play here? So on one hand, we have in the book, as far as possible, a precise description of whales as a species, a biological classification of whales, other descriptions, depictions of whales, etc. And on the other hand, some of the animals, including Moby Dick, are described as something almost like formless, with the emphasis on the white color of these animals being the key point. And Moby Dick appears at several points in the book as also something more of an apparition. But what does Moby Dick mean for Ahab? I will quote a longer passage here to also show the difference, what it means in Ahab's perception and in the perception of one of his crew members. Vengeance on a dumb brute, cried Starbuck, that simply smote thee from blindest instinct, madness. To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous. Hark ye yet again the little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but a pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there's some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask, how can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, showed near to me. Sometimes I think there's nothing beyond, but it's enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. that inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak hate upon him. End of quote. So according to Ahab, Moby Dick is not a dumb animal, but something radically different, not even a whale, perhaps a white wall of the signifier, something that Ahab must penetrate in order to find something Ahab on the other side. But ultimately, it does not even matter what or who Moby Dick is, if he is at all, because what matters most is that he has taken the place of Ahab. So the main problem with Moby Dick is, and also some other whales, that what they did is that they did not simply let themselves be hunted, they became the hunters and took the place that belongs to man. So it is no longer a question of attributing this or that characteristic, but of not being able to write off a characteristic, write off the work of the whale Walton. So in the end, Ahab catches Moby Dick and himself, he catches his own death. Ahab dies, the ship sinks, the sea swallows it, the sea swallows Moby Dick, but in the end, we don't find out if Moby Dick dies, and it doesn't even matter because Moby Dick dies with Ahab. The prophecy is fulfilled for Ahab, who was not only his own prophet and fulfiller, but he was also his own dismemberer, and he has now dismembered his dismemberer. Or perhaps Moby Dick does not die because he cannot die, because he survives as a species, as Melville writes. As a species, he will forever remain impregnable. Interestingly, one of the chapters in Moby Dick from 1851 is solely devoted to the question of possible extinction of whales due to overfishing. So the only survivor is the narrator of the story, Ismail, and he survives in and because of the coffin. Let me return to Freud again. So after the before cited passage on separation between man and animal, Freud continues. Curiously enough, this piece of arrogance is still foreign to children, just as it is to primitive and primeval man. It is the result of a later, more pretentious stage of development. At the level of totemism, primitive man had no repugnance to tracing his descent from an animal ancestor. In myths which contain the precipitate of this ancient attitude of mind, the gods take animal shapes, and in the art of earliest times they are portrayed with animals' heads. A child can see no difference between his own nature and that of animals. Of course, one way of reading it is in terms of analogous processes of evolution and growing up, a process in which both man and humanity leave behind their animality, but I would like to focus here on something else, on the potentiality of a grotesque imagery that is mentioned in Freud's text as a specific representation of gods, not as animals, but with animal parts. So grotesque is a concept whose appearance in different contexts does little to clarify the concept itself, rather the opposite. Also Foucault, when introducing the concept of grotesque sovereignty, refers to this difficulty with grotesque. Grotesque as an aesthetic concept is positioned more or less on the fringes of the aesthetic theory, often mixed up with satire or with bizarre, surreal, and or perceived as the opposite of the sublime. Although, for example, Victor Hugo writes of grotesque as of completion of the sublime. According to Hugo, only when grotesque and sublime coincide, they produce the truly beautiful. So grotesque creates the formless and the terrifying. And precisely in case of Moby Dick, we can see how both modes might coincide. After all, Moby Dick is not only a classic work of American world literature, but also a classic work of American grotesque. So grotesque is very often described as deeply related to the uncanny. So one of the most well-known passages from Freud's Das Unheimliche, uncanny as that which springs from what has always been known, the long familiar, and which is at the same time which is supposed to remain secret, concealed, and has come to light, is derived from Schlegel, who was also one of the first to build a more extensive scholarship on grotesque. Schlegel mentions the grotesque in his discourse on poetry, without giving any clear terminological definitions, but he considers it as the most ancient form of human fantasy and the natural form of poetry. So grotesque refers to the depiction of necessary irresolvables of the opposites, or of what is otherwise conceived of as opposites. What is supposed to be the opposite is therefore necessarily contained and unresolved in the grotesque, horror and laughter, human and non-humans, and there is no exclusive or permanent state of something which does not already contain within it something else. So grotesque is in some forms at least an inappropriate expression of the problematical nature of existence. And even though what is considered grotesque is always tied to historical context, grotesque imagery is of extremely ancient type. So we find it in the mythology and archaic art of all peoples. So at the heart of the grotesque then is its indestructible transhistorical essence captured by the grotesque image, at the center of which is the grotesque body, as is evident from the very origins of the grotesque. So in its search for grotesque's core, the theory therefore most often resorts to the etymology or supposed origin of the grotesque itself, to the paintings of Roman underground Domus Aurea from Nero's times, discovered in 15th century, which depicts hybrids between humans, animals, and plants. So at the center of the grotesque image is the epitome of incompleteness, the grotesque body, which is the unfinished and open body, not separated from the world by clearly defined boundaries. It is blended with the world, with animals, with objects. Therefore, grotesque body is not a closed, completed unit. It is unfinished, outgrows itself, transgresses its own limits. And it refers to a certain realism. Grotesque, or its understanding of the body, thus also returns in a specific historically conditioned way within a post-humanist understanding of corporeality. But that is already another uncanny story. Thank you.
Thank you. We have indeed time for questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Vesna. I think my question is rather simple and maybe arises just from my feeling of tiredness. But I'm wondering how the passage you quoted from Freud, in which he compares the primitive depictions of hybrid animal humans to the sort of depictions in games of children and their identifications with animals. I mean, how is this relate to Ahab's strange identification in relation to Moby Dick? I was unsure of the relationship between these two concepts and how they're operating in your analysis.
I wasn't thinking of the depictions of children, but this basically, I think he's referring to this archaic art, Freud. So I was referring to this part where gods are depicted with animals' heads. Yeah, I mean, the main trait is the grotesque imagery, basically. We see in Ahab is without the leg, and also Moby Dick is, I mean, they both have wounds and are basically, they have an incomplete body. Well, that's on a bodily level, that's this one comparison how this grotesque imagery basically is sort of like a trait that goes throughout history. Even though the concept of the grotesque changes, there's this body as incomplete or compound that sort of remains as, yeah, at the core of the grotesque. Yeah. So that was basically a supposed line of thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting lecture. I really liked it. My question is very short. It's very simple. In a way, I think, okay, you said that basically the grotesque is some sort of combination of a human body with animal elements. I mean, probably tomorrow when Marisa will be talking about monstrosity, there is some similarity here. But what I'm wondering, and I'm talking basically factically from the history of the concept of grotesque, I wrote also about that. For instance, if you take Suetonius as a basis, I mean, we don't know really what Nero was like. We know films about Nero, we know Quo Vadis, and basically we know Suetonius, which was a famous slandering novel, and Foucault is actually referring to Suetonius, who wrote about 13 Roman emperors, and he described them in, how could I say, very sexualized way, including all of their very weird perversions and so on, probably exaggerating, because otherwise, I mean, Rome would be a very, very strange world. But and this was made, what was interesting here, and what was Foucault actually referring to is that he thought that it is a part of imperial power to do so, because Suetonius himself was basically employed by the government, and he was kind of making some sort of a circle of creating a power which in a way manifests itself as grotesque. But my question is much simpler. I think that there is a third element. If we take, for instance, Suetonius or any other basically phenomenon of grotesque, I think that, okay, that there is this animal body mixed with human, but there is also the moment of sexuality. And I'm asking this because, I mean, it's a psychoanalytical conference in a certain way, but I think that this is the third component. I mean, maybe the question is there any sort of grotesque which does not involve this kind of diventare porca in a certain way? I mean, this is a concept I develop in a context I will not talk about here, but I mean, would you agree that this is also some sort of element here?
Yeah, I mean, for me it was very interesting, like reading like all those different theories of grotesque, like as an aesthetic concept, that they really differ some. There's like, I mean, so the only thing that remains is like this grotesque image of a grotesque body, which is of course not only human, animal, but also with other parts. And I think I really like Bakhtin's work on the topic, and he's doing with Rabelais, and he has these sexual elements, I think, with I mean, of course, with genitalia and nose as one of those parts of body that are also like, and of course this whole cycle of course, he analyzes the Renaissance grotesque, and he's doing Gargantua and Pantagruel, which is yeah, also sexual in very specific way. But I think that was the only example I found where there was this element so explicit. I mean, we probably can find it in Kaiser and so on, so explicit.
Maybe not just about the body, it's also something that surrounds the body, that in the context there's always a little bit of that. So, I mean, because then we maybe, okay, I will not push this. We have time, maybe sometime we can discuss this.
Any more questions? I'll ask you a question, don't mind. Well, thank you very much for the paper. My question is trying to put together what you genealogically traced in terms of like Freud on the grotesque, the uncanny, and then this reversal of opposites, animal, human, via Moby Dick, but then also like your early reference to Foucault. So to cut a long story short, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're taking the grotesque as, in loosely speaking political terms, as an aesthetics of subversion or something similar. And I think it works very well. But on the other hand, maybe going back to Alice a bit, I mean, when you read Foucault on grotesque sovereignty, and this is a link which has been made, you cannot but think of our Neros. You cannot think of Trump. You cannot think of Berlusconi. We can go on. So my question is, are you also assessing the potential, wouldn't that be the ultimate grotesque? That is to say that the grotesque as an aesthetic, if not potential political category, could be very well adapted to both a narrative of subversion, but also to a narrative of a ingrained power, which is always already subversive, Porco, like you said, Nero, Trump, and that's where Foucault is probably both right and wrong, because he's right in pointing the finger at that, but as Alice said, there's nothing new under the sun, right? We don't need biopolitics there, we don't need periodization. So the question is, grotesque as subversive aesthetics, if not politics, but what about if the supreme move of the grotesque is that it can be at the same time the opposite? So a force of transgressive reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, yeah, I think, yeah, that's a very good commentary also for what I will be further developing, because as I said, this is just some preliminary thoughts. And sort of, I was thinking something similar when I was reading, as I mentioned, Bakhtin and work on Rabelais, because he's making this carnival culture, folk humor, but he sort of misses this element, actually, that, you know, Gargantua and Pantagruel, they were actually like rulers. Mm. And this is what I was, when I was then parallelly reading Foucault, I was thinking, how can he miss that point, actually, and put an emphasis only to this transgressiveness of folk humor, and so yeah.
Yeah. One final question, if there is any? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Vesna. And